1 John chapter 4, verse 1, Beloved, do not believe every spirit, but test the spirits to see whether they are from God. For many false prophets have gone out into the world. Notice once again, John's using a term of endearment, beloved. He had already mentioned 3 times that they were his little children. John being advanced in years, in his 90s at this point. He's writing to the church there in Ephesus and to the surrounding churches in Asia Minor, which you guys may remember from the book of Revelation, the 7 churches in Asia Minor. He's writing to them and he views them as his beloved. He loves them and he cares for them so much that he calls them little children. That he wants to protect them and to keep them from, as we already saw in chapter 1 and 2, from false teaching. And now these false teachers that have come up, as we know from history, Cerinthius and his Gnostic teachings, taking away people from the church. And John being so upset that in history it writes that they went to the same public bathhouse to get clean. And John was in there and he heard that Cerinthius was coming and he hastily moved out of the bathhouse. And Polycarp records that he had cursed the bathhouse and prayed that God would bring down the roof of the bathhouse on Cerinthius. Yeah, John wasn't a big fan of false teachers. But he says to test them whether they are from God or not. He doesn't just say, let them have their little corner and let them do their thing. Much of American Christianity says that. Well, let bygones be bygones and just let them do their own thing. But no, John says to test them, to see if they are really in the faith or not. For many false prophets have gone out into the world, but not just out, not as though they just came out of nowhere and exist. No, they came out from within the church. False teachers so often start in the church to gather for themselves a following, and then they take them from the church to start their own thing. The last couple of weeks, I've gotten more requests from prophets, apostles, and quote-unquote pastors in Africa than in my entire lifetime. Thankfully, I have a couple good brothers that I know that I can send these forward to and say, who are these people? And more often than not, they will go, they're false prophets, they're false teachers. Delete them, ignore them, don't have anything to do with them. And it's real easy to see because the first thing I get a message from these people asking me, my friends on Facebook, is, I've got this ministry here in Africa, give me money. Not anything about them or what they're doing, it's, give me. And not only that, one of them in particular who claims to be an apostle has been doing quote-unquote healing services in which there's people being paid to be actors to pretend that they're in a wheelchair or have crutches and be miraculously healed when the people that actually know those playing actors know that they're number one actors and that they're getting paid to do it. It's just amazing that especially in a country like Africa, where most people have 1/100th what we do, and yet they freely give to these showmen, these hucksters, and are being deceived. This is why John writes, 1 John chapter 4, do not believe every spirit, but test the spirits to see whether they are from God. And he's going to give us this test in just a moment. He's going to tell us what it is we need to do to test these individuals. But your first fill in the blank there in your outlines is little children. Little children. Number 2 is to try the spirits. Not just appease them, not just put up with them, is to try them. And number 3, many false prophets. Not just 1 or 2, not just 3 or 4, many. If I could show you guys my Facebook requests from all these different people. It's probably been in the last year in the hundreds of people all over the world claiming to be this and that and the other thing, supposedly have some type of ministry, but are frauds. Many false prophets. Reminds me of something as I dealt with my parents leaving the church. I remember being in a men's Bible study with my grandfather. And we were going through 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus. And then we went through 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John. In that year after I got saved and was baptized with my grandfather. In 1 John chapter 2, John wrote, "They went out from us," speaking of Cerinthius and his followers, "but they were not of us. For if they had been of us, they would have continued with us. But they went out that it might become plain that they are not of us." They started in the church and they left and they didn't continue. And they started their own thing. They did their own thing. They denied the one who bought them. They denied the very basics of the Christian faith. They went out from us because they were not of us. It's hard to swallow. In the years post my parents leaving the church, it was hard to swallow that this was talking about my parents. This is hard, thinking that this was talking about my parents. They'd gone to church, they were Sunday school teachers, and yet they denied the faith and left the church. They were not of us at any point. They might have played church. They might have done it because it was the social thing to do. They might have done it for the connections that were in the church. But it's not because they were Christians. They proved that when they left the church and say that they're either agnostic or atheist. Reminds me of what Jesus said in Matthew chapter 24. "And many false prophets will arise and lead many astray." Jesus isn't shy about the numbers here. There are going to be few that remain. There are going to be few that still follow him. But there are many false prophets and many false converts, as we like to call them. False believers that follow men that don't believe the Bible, men that don't teach the Bible. I'm reminded specifically in the last 10 years, a particular teacher has been becoming very popular on TV and has books, the internet, Christian booksellers, in which he got very popular, got a large church and a large following. Then he came out with a book called Love Wins, in which he presents universalism. Everybody's going to be saved. So you don't need to tell somebody the gospel because eventually everybody's going to get saved anyways. So you don't need to fight for the lives of unborn children. You don't need to explain the ills of homosexuality and gender studies. Everybody just goes to heaven in the end. It's okay. Just wait it out. In the end, love wins. So much so that then he starts adopting proto-Gnostic ideas that Jesus began to receive the Christ spirit. That Jesus was just a man and then only on the cross he became divine. But only for a moment. And then the Christ consciousness left him. That's the same type of thing that started all the way back here in the 1st century with Cerinthius, in which John was specifically writing to fight. And yet this particular gentleman now has multi-best-selling books and is at quote-unquote Christian conferences all over the place. 2 Peter chapter 2, "But false prophets also arose among the people, just as there will be false teachers among you, who secretly bring in destructive heresies, even denying the master who bought them, bringing upon themselves swift destruction." See this very popular guy in denying the master that bought him, and denying the very basic tenets of the Christian faith that have been written down from the beginning. That even during the time in which this letter is being written, there's something called the Didache also being written. It's not the Bible, but it's a list of doctrines in which early Christians believed, in which the number one thing that they write down is that Jesus is the Son of God wrapped in flesh, come in the flesh. The very thing John's saying you have to believe. And the very thing he's saying these false teachers are rejecting. These false prophets rose among the people, and there will be false teachers among us today. All you have to do is look around at the TV, the radio, and the internet to see them. And there's more false teachers than good teachers. Verse 2. By this you will know the Spirit of God. Every spirit that confesses that Jesus Christ has come in the flesh is from God. Often those that deny the divinity of Christ, him coming in the flesh, will go one of two routes. Either Jesus was just an illusion and he was spirit, or Jesus was just a man and wasn't God. Those are one of the two main ways false teachers go. And yet John is saying, you know, that neither of them then are true Christians. Neither of those groups really believe the gospel, because the gospel is fully God, fully man, wrapped in flesh. John chapter 1, verse 1 and verse 14. Fill in the blank number 4 in your outline says, this is how you'll know. This is our confession. This is our belief that has been stated for 2 millennia, is that Jesus is Christ incarnate. Fully God, fully man, wrapped in flesh. Verse 3 in 1 John chapter 4. And every spirit that does not confess Jesus is not from God. Now let's pause here for a moment. It's hard to think of, we see all over the place that people are professing the name Jesus, but it may not be the same Jesus that's in the Bible. Paul warns us in Romans chapter 1 that we can make a God after our own image and after our own likeness. That we can imagine a God in which we worship that's not the same Jesus in the Bible. Oh yeah, we say the name Jesus, but it's not the same one who we celebrate his birth, his death, his burial, and his resurrection. They paint a picture of a Jesus that is either only spirit or is only flesh. They paint a Jesus that could have failed, or painted a Jesus that didn't do anything. This is not the Jesus that came for us. This is, as John writes here in verse 4, the spirit of the Antichrist, which you heard is coming and is in the world already. Notice there, he uses, which you heard is coming, future tense, which now is already in the world. So there, John was warning the church in Ephesus and there in Asia Minor that the spirit of the Antichrist against Christ was already in the world. Well, we'd already seen that. Cerinthius is taking away people to a pseudo-Jesus, to a Jesus that cannot save. Same thing's happening in our day, in which John then writes. We have to remember that John wrote 1st, 2nd, 3rd John after he wrote the book of Revelation. He was on exile on the island of Patmos. He wrote the book of Revelation. Then after he is released, he goes to Ephesus and ministers there till the end of his days, in which, according to tradition, he's buried there. It's then when he's in Ephesus, he's writing these letters. He'd already seen the end of the story. He'd already received his revelation about Jesus wins in the end over the Antichrist and the one who was to come. He'd already seen the Antichrist, the false prophet, and the beast. He'd already seen that Jesus wins over them. He's dealing with the current Antichrist, and he's warning them of the Antichrist that is to come. Number 5 in your outlines is the spirit of the Antichrist. The spirit of the Antichrist. And that one will come, yet future, in which many Christians, including myself, are wondering who might it be? Who's going to be this world leader that combines everybody to one world religion, one world currency, one world government. Who's it going to be? It's an interesting thought, interesting side note. I don't think we're going to see him, but it's interesting to think about. But the thing that we need to be worried about more is not the Antichrist to come, is the Antichrists, plural, that are already here, that are already in the world. Are we doing what he said in verse 1? Are we testing them, whether they are of God or not of God? Or are we just, ho-hum, they say they're Christians, it's okay, let's all get around the fire and sing Kumbaya? Verse 4, little children, we'll pause there for a moment. Once again, these are his beloved and these are his little children. He's in his 90s and he cares for them so much that he calls them his children. Much like Paul calls Timothy his son in the faith, John views the church here in Ephesus and the churches in Asia Minor and who he's ministering to as his children. What parent doesn't want to protect their children from false teaching? What parent doesn't want to protect their kids from lies and untruths? What parent wouldn't give their life for their child? That's the same thing that John is expressing here. I care for you so much, I want to guard you against this false teaching. You are from God and have overcome them. Notice past tense. It's already done. You have already overcome these antichrists. For he who is in you is greater than he who is in the world. He who is in you, that, as Paul puts it, that Jesus that resides in the temple not made with hands, the Spirit of God that leads us and guides us, is greater than he who is in the world. Who is the one who is in the world? Satan, the prince of the power of the air, the ruler of this world for this time. You have overcome them, plural. The antichrists, the false prophets, and Satan. Why is John able to say this? Well, he just got done receiving the revelation. He knows the end game. He knows the end story, that in the end Jesus wins and that Jesus sets up his kingdom. He's able to see that Satan and his demons are bound and exiled for eternity, and that the saints win. As he writes, number 8, you are of God. You're not of the world, not of the Antichrist. You, the churches he's writing to, are of God. Once again, he uses little children. Teknia in the Greek. His precious, although after watching Lord of the Rings with Hannah last night, precious has a different meaning and understanding, but precious to him. And number 10, that they have conquered. They have conquered. Past tense. John sees it as already being accomplished. And yet, we see both present and past tense being used in the Bible when talking about those who conquer. In 1 John chapter 2, we go back, as John's writing about his purpose in writing this whole letter, all of 1 John, he says, I write to you, fathers, because you know him who is from the beginning. I write to you, young men, because you are strong, and the word of God abides in you. And you have overcome the evil one. You have overcome. He's writing them because he knows that they have overcome and will overcome him. In John 16, Jesus says, I've said these things to you, that in me you may have peace. In the world you will have tribulation, but take heart. I have overcome the world, the ruler of the world, the Antichrist, all those who come against you. I have overcome them through his death, his burial, and his resurrection. John records in his revelation, in his view of what the end times is going to be, 3 times in chapter 3, chapter 12, and chapter 17. First, he starts writing to the one who conquers, the one who is able to go through tribulation. Then he writes, and they have conquered. That it's now then behind them. and then more importantly, that the Lord will conquer them. Since John has seen this whole process laid out in front of him, the process of conquering, what happens after they conquer, and when the Lord reigns. He sees them, and no wonder then he can write to the Ephesian church and say, you are conquerors. You have overcome. Not only giving them the strength to endure the day, but to endure to the end. And number 11, unfortunately, there's a typo in our outlines. It should say 1 John chapter 4, verse 4, not James 4:6. But he that is in you is greater than he who is in the world. This ties right along with actually James 4:7. Resist the devil and he will flee. If you know that he who is in you is greater than he who is in the world, then you are able to conquer. Then you are able to resist the devil and for him to flee. This is the whole point in John writing, that they have conquered. To give them the tools and the courage to fight the good fight, to run the race, and to win.